Hermann Göring was one of the most powerful and most corrupt figures in Nazi Germany. Serving as Hitler's designated successor, commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, head of the four-year plan with enormous economic authority, and holder of numerous other positions that made him second only to Hitler himself for much of the Nazi regime's existence. Göring was also notorious for his vanity, his extravagant lifestyle, his obsessive collecting of art and treasures, and his shameless use of his position to enrich himself through theft, extortion, and corruption, on a scale that was extraordinary even by Nazi standards. The physical embodiment of Göring's power and greed was Carinhall, his massive country estate located in the Schorfheide forest northeast of Berlin. Named after his first wife, Carin, who had died in 1931, Carinhall was a sprawling complex of buildings, gardens, and parkland where Göring displayed his looted art collection, entertained guests with lavish hospitality, and lived like a Renaissance prince, while Nazi Germany plundered Europe and murdered millions. When World War II ended in May 1945, with Nazi Germany's defeat, and with Göring himself arrested and awaiting trial as a war criminal, what happened to his beloved Carinhall estate? Was the magnificent hunting lodge preserved, destroyed, or repurposed? What became of the art treasures and furnishings that filled its halls? How did the area transition from being Göring's private domain to becoming part of post-war Germany? Today we'll explore the fascinating and tragic story of Carinhall's fate from its construction in the 1930s through its deliberate destruction by Göring's own orders in April 1945, examining its brief existence as a monument to Nazi power and corruption. The looting and evacuation that preceded its destruction, its complete demolition, to prevent it from falling intact into Soviet hands, and what remains of the site today. This is a story about hubris and downfall, about the physical manifestation of Nazi looting and excess, about the ephemeral nature of power built on theft and violence, and about how one of Nazi Germany's most grandiose private residences was reduced to rubble and has largely vanished from the landscape, leaving only scattered ruins and historical memory. To understand what happened to Carinhall after the war, we must first understand what Carinhall was, how it was created, and what it represented during the Nazi period. Hermann Göring acquired property in the Schorfheide forest area northeast of Berlin in the early 1930s, shortly after the Nazis came to power. The Schorfheide was and remains a vast forested region that had historically been hunting grounds for Prussian aristocracy and German leaders. Göring, who fancied himself a modern Teutonic knight and Renaissance prince, was attracted to the area's association with German history and tradition, and he wanted to create a country retreat that would reflect his power, his taste, and his status as the second most important man in Nazi Germany. Construction of Carinhall began in 1933, initially as a relatively modest hunting lodge and country house. However, as Göring's power and wealth grew throughout the 1930s, Carinhall expanded dramatically into an enormous estate complex. By the late 1930s and early 1940s, Carinhall had grown to include a massive main house built in a style intended to evoke Germanic and Nordic traditions with timber construction, a great hall with soaring ceilings and massive fireplaces, numerous rooms for entertaining and displaying Göring's art collection, private apartments for Göring and his second wife, Emmy, whom he married in 1935, guest suites, servants' quarters, and elaborate facilities including a gymnasium, a swimming pool, a library, and various other amenities. The estate grounds included extensive landscaped gardens, lakes and waterways, forests for hunting, facilities for Göring's collection of exotic animals, including lions and bison that he kept in a private zoo, an airstrip for his personal aircraft, and various outbuildings and support facilities. At its peak, Carinhall covered approximately 60,000 acres of forest and parkland, making it one of the largest private estates in Germany. The architecture and decoration of Carinhall were designed to project an image of Germanic grandeur and to provide appropriate settings for Göring's massive art collection. The Great Hall at the center of the main building was particularly impressive, with timber beams, a huge fireplace, tapestries, and hunting trophies on the walls, and space for entertaining hundreds of guests. Göring used Carinhall to host elaborate parties, hunts, and receptions for Nazi leaders, foreign dignitaries, artists, and others whose favor he sought or whose company he enjoyed. These gatherings were characterized by extravagant food and drink, by entertainment including musicians and performers, by displays of Göring's art treasures, and by the overall atmosphere of luxury and excess that Göring cultivated. The estate served both personal and political functions, providing Göring with a retreat from Berlin and a showcase for his power and wealth that enhanced his prestige, and that allowed him to conduct informal diplomacy and political business in impressive surroundings. The contents of Carinhall were as extraordinary as the buildings and grounds. Göring was an obsessive art collector who used his position to amass one of the largest private art collections in Europe through a combination of quasi-legal purchases, coerced sales, and outright theft. His collection included old master paintings by artists including Rembrandt, Rubens, Cranach, and countless others, sculptures, tapestries, furniture, decorative arts, books and manuscripts, and virtually every category of valuable artistic and cultural property. Much of this collection was looted from Jewish families who were forced to sell at fractions of true value, or whose property was simply confiscated, from museums in occupied countries, from churches and monasteries, and from any source where Göring could obtain treasures through his power and his willingness to steal. Göring worked with art dealers, with the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, which looted art in occupied territories, and with various other channels to obtain pieces for his collection, competing with Hitler's acquisitions for the planned Linz Museum, but generally deferring to Hitler when their interests conflicted, while still managing to accumulate an enormous personal collection. Carinhall's rooms were filled with this looted art, with masterpieces hanging on walls, sculptures displayed throughout the building, rare furniture and decorative objects filling every space, and treasures packed into storage when display space ran out. Göring would spend hours viewing his collection, showing pieces to visitors and planning future acquisitions. He commissioned a detailed photographic inventory of his collection, creating albums of photographs that documented each major piece, records that would prove valuable after the war for tracking looted art, but that during the war served Göring's pride and his desire to catalog his treasures. The collection represented not just Göring's personal taste and his vanity, but also the systematic theft and cultural plunder that characterized Nazi occupation of Europe, concentrated in one man's private estate as a monument to greed and corruption. Göring's lifestyle at Carinhall was extravagant and self-indulgent, even by the standards of Nazi leadership. He would arrive at the estate by car or by landing his personal aircraft on the private airstrip, often wearing elaborate hunting costumes and uniforms of his own design. He enjoyed hunting in the estate's forests, hosting hunting parties where he and his guests would kill deer, boar, and other game. He loved showing visitors around Carinhall, personally conducting tours of his art collection and his various facilities, clearly taking immense pride in his possessions and his estate. He ate lavishly, contributing to his obesity and his health problems, and he entertained guests with generous hospitality, including abundant food, fine wines, and comfortable accommodations. His daily routine at Carinhall included time viewing his art collection, walks in the grounds, hunting, and generally enjoying the life of a wealthy aristocrat, all made possible by his abuse of power and his corruption. As World War II progressed, and as Germany's military situation deteriorated, Carinhall took on additional significance as a refuge and as a symbol of Göring's power, even as that power waned. Göring's reputation suffered as the Luftwaffe failed to prevent Allied bombing of German cities, failed to win the Battle of Britain, and generally proved unable to achieve the air superiority that Göring had promised. Hitler lost confidence in Göring, and Göring's influence declined, though he retained his formal positions and titles. Göring spent increasing amounts of time at Carinhall, retreating from active leadership and from Hitler's criticism, hunting and viewing his art collection, while Germany collapsed around him. He also became increasingly addicted to morphine and other drugs, further impairing his judgment and effectiveness. Carinhall became less a showcase of power and more a refuge for a man whose best days were behind him and who was increasingly disconnected from the reality of Germany's impending defeat. By early 1945, as Soviet forces advanced from the east and approached the Schorfheide area where Carinhall was located, Göring faced the reality that his beloved estate would soon be overrun. The approaching Soviet army represented not just military defeat, but also personal catastrophe for Göring, as Carinhall and everything it contained would fall into enemy hands unless he took action. In March and early April 1945, Göring ordered the evacuation of Carinhall, directing his staff to pack and remove the most valuable and portable items from the estate. This evacuation was a massive undertaking, requiring trucks and trains to transport the thousands of artworks, furnishings, and treasures that filled Carinhall. Göring prioritized his art collection, having the most valuable paintings, sculptures, and objects packed carefully and shipped to various locations, including the Bavarian Alps, where Göring had other properties, and where he hoped to retreat as Berlin fell. The evacuation of Carinhall was chaotic and incomplete. There was limited time as Soviet forces approached rapidly, and there was limited transportation as Germany's infrastructure collapsed under Allied bombing, and as military needs took priority. Göring's staff worked frantically to pack and remove items, but much had to be left behind due to time and logistical constraints. Furniture, tapestries, less valuable artworks, books, and countless other items remained at Carinhall as the evacuation deadline approached. Some items were damaged during hasty packing and transport, and some were lost or stolen by workers during the chaotic evacuation process. The systematic, photographic documentation that Göring had commissioned of his collection would later help track some of these pieces. But in the moment, the evacuation was a desperate attempt to save what could be saved from the approaching Red Army. In mid-April 1945, as Soviet forces were within days of reaching Carinhall, Göring made the extraordinary decision to destroy his beloved estate rather than let it fall intact into Soviet hands. On April 20th, 1945, Hitler's birthday and the day Berlin came under final Soviet assault, Göring ordered German combat engineers to demolish Carinhall. The engineers planted explosives throughout the main buildings and detonated them, creating massive explosions that destroyed the structures that Göring had spent over a decade building and furnishing. The Great Hall, where he had entertained dignitaries, collapsed. The rooms where his art collection had hung were blown apart. The facilities and amenities were reduced to rubble. The deliberate destruction of Carinhall was comprehensive, with the engineers tasked with ensuring that nothing useful remained for Soviet forces. Additional fires were set to consume what the explosions did not destroy, and by the time the demolition was complete, Carinhall was a smoking ruin with little left standing. Göring's decision to destroy Carinhall reflected both practical and psychological motivations. Practically, he wanted to deny the Soviets the use of the buildings and to prevent them from capturing intact the art and treasures that remained despite the evacuation efforts. Psychologically, Göring could not bear the thought of his personal creation, the estate that embodied his power and taste, falling into enemy hands and being desecrated or used by those who had defeated him. The destruction was an act of spite and defiance, a refusal to allow his enemies to enjoy or benefit from what he could no longer keep. It also reflected the scorched earth mentality that characterized Nazi Germany's final months, with Hitler and other leaders ordering the destruction of German infrastructure and resources rather than allowing them to fall to the Allies. Göring's destruction of Carinhall was personal rather than strategic, serving no military purpose but satisfying his emotional need to destroy what he could not keep. After destroying Carinhall, Göring fled south toward Bavaria, where he attempted to position himself as Hitler's successor once Hitler's death became known. However, Göring's telegram to Hitler asking for permission to assume leadership was interpreted by Martin Bormann and others in Hitler's bunker as treason and betrayal. Hitler, in one of his final acts, ordered Göring's arrest and stripped him of all positions and titles, ending Göring's official role in Nazi Germany. Göring was arrested by SS forces, but was released as Germany collapsed into chaos. After Hitler's suicide on April 30th, 1945, and Germany's surrender on May 8th, 1945, Göring was captured by American forces on May 9th, 1945. He was imprisoned, interrogated, and eventually tried at the Nuremberg International Military Tribunal, where he was convicted of war crimes, crimes against peace, crimes against humanity, and conspiracy to commit these crimes. He was sentenced to death by hanging, but he committed suicide by taking cyanide on October 15, 1946, just hours before his scheduled execution, cheating the hangman and dying on his own terms, though not escaping justice entirely. Soviet forces arrived at the Carinhall site in late April 1945, shortly after the demolition, and found the smoldering ruins of what had been one of Nazi Germany's most impressive private estates. Soviet soldiers and officers explored the destroyed complex, searching through rubble for anything of value that might have survived the demolition and the fires. They found relatively little, as the evacuation and destruction had been thorough, though some items undoubtedly were recovered from the ruins, including damaged artworks, fragments of furnishings, and various other debris. Soviet forces photographed the ruins, documenting the destruction, and Soviet authorities eventually removed some materials from the site. However, Carinhall held limited interest for Soviet forces, as it had no strategic value, and most of its treasures had been removed or destroyed. The site was simply one more destroyed Nazi facility among thousands across Germany. The area where Carinhall had stood became part of the Soviet occupation zone of Germany and later of East Germany when Germany was divided. The Schorfheide forest area remained relatively remote and rural, and the ruins of Carinhall were left largely undisturbed. Local residents and Soviet occupation forces occasionally visited the site, salvaging bricks, timber, and other building materials from the ruins for use in reconstruction elsewhere, a common practice in the post-war period when building materials were scarce. Over time, nature began to reclaim the site, with vegetation growing over the rubble, trees sprouting among the ruins, and the forest gradually covering what had been Göring's grand estate. The process of natural reclamation was relatively rapid in the forest environment, and within years, the ruins were significantly overgrown and difficult to identify for those who did not know what to look for. During the decades when East Germany existed, from 1949 to 1990, the Carinhall site remained obscure and largely forgotten. The East German Communist government had no interest in preserving or memorializing a Nazi estate, particularly one that had belonged to a figure as associated with Nazi corruption and excess as Göring. The official East German historical narrative emphasized anti-fascist resistance and the role of the working class in opposing Nazism, with little attention to the details of individual Nazi leaders' lives or properties. The Carinhall site was not marked, was not developed as a historical site or memorial, and was not publicized. It existed as forgotten ruins in a forest that was used for forestry, for hunting, and for recreation, with the site itself known only to local residents and to a few historians and enthusiasts who were aware of its history and location. The forests of the Schorfheide, including the area where Carinhall had stood, were used during the East German period for various purposes, including as hunting grounds for East German leaders, continuing the area's historical association with elite hunting that had attracted Göring in the first place. However, the specific site of Carinhall's ruins was not particularly noted or distinguished from the surrounding forest, and most of those hunting in the area likely did not know or care about the Nazi-era history beneath their feet. The site gradually faded from public consciousness, known primarily through historical documentation and through the memories of the generation that had experienced the war. Memories that were not extensively shared or commemorated in East Germany's official culture. After German reunification in 1990, interest in the Carinhall site increased somewhat as access to formerly East German areas opened up and as historical research into the Nazi period intensified. Historians, journalists, and history enthusiasts began visiting the site, exploring the overgrown ruins, and documenting what remained. Archaeological surveys were conducted to map the extent of the ruins and to understand the layout of the original complex. These investigations revealed that despite the deliberate destruction and despite decades of natural reclamation, substantial traces of Carinhall remained underground and in the form of scattered ruins. Foundations of buildings, remnants of walls, fragments of the landscaping, including parts of the water features and gardens, sections of roadways and paths, and various other physical traces could still be identified by those who knew what to look for and who were willing to explore the overgrown forest site. However, post-reunification Germany faced questions about what to do with the Carinhall site, similar to questions about other Nazi-era properties and monuments. Should the ruins be excavated, preserved, and interpreted as a historical site? Should they be left to continue their natural decay and gradual disappearance? Should they be completely cleared and the site restored to natural forest? These questions reflected broader debates about how to memorialize and interpret difficult heritage associated with the Nazi period. Different perspectives existed, with some arguing for preservation and interpretation for educational purposes, others arguing for deliberate erasure to deny any platform for neo-Nazi sentiment, and still others arguing for benign neglect, allowing nature to take its course. The approach that has been taken regarding Carinhall has been essentially benign neglect with limited interpretation. The ruins have not been excavated or preserved in any systematic way. They have not been developed as a tourist attraction or historical site, with facilities, regular tours, or extensive interpretation. The site remains as forest land, with the ruins continuing to be overgrown and gradually deteriorating. However, the location of Carinhall is known and has been marked with a modest memorial stone that provides basic historical information about the estate and about Göring. The memorial does not glorify Göring or Nazi Germany, but simply acknowledges the historical fact that Carinhall existed at this location and provides context about what it was and what happened to it. The approach is similar to that taken with some other Nazi sites, where there is acknowledgement of history without extensive preservation or development. Visitors interested in the Carinhall site can access the general area, though finding the specific ruins requires some knowledge of their location and some willingness to explore overgrown forest. Various historical markers and information boards have been placed in the broader Schorfheide area, providing information about the region's history, including the Nazi period, and some of these mention Carinhall. Local tour guides and history groups occasionally lead visits to the Carinhall ruins, explaining the site's history and showing visitors the scattered remains that can still be found. However, these visits are not extensively promoted or commercialized, reflecting German authorities' preference for acknowledgement without glorification or extensive tourism development. The physical remains visible at the Carinhall site today are relatively modest, given the estate's former grandeur. Visitors exploring the forest can find scattered bricks and stones, fragments of foundations and walls, depressions in the ground marking where buildings stood, traces of the landscaping including what may be remnants of water features, and various other subtle traces that reveal the human use of this forest area in the past. However, there are no standing structures, no intact rooms or halls to explore, and nothing that conveys the scale and opulence of what Carinhall was during its brief existence. The forest has largely reclaimed the site, with mature trees growing where buildings once stood, and with undergrowth covering most traces. For those aware of the history, the site can be evocative and thought-provoking, a place to contemplate the rise and fall of Nazi power and the ephemeral nature of monuments built on theft and violence. For those unaware of the history, the site is simply forest, indistinguishable from the surrounding Schorfheide landscape. The question of what happened to the art and treasures that filled Carinhall is central to understanding the estate's post-war legacy. As mentioned, Göring ordered evacuation of the most valuable items in March and early April 1945, and these pieces were shipped to various locations. Many ended up in Bavaria, where Göring had other properties, and where he fled in April 1945. When American forces occupied Bavaria and captured Göring, they also discovered his evacuated art collection. The American Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives program, the Monuments men took custody of thousands of artworks that had belonged to Göring, cataloging them and beginning the process of identifying rightful owners and arranging restitution. The photographic inventory that Göring had commissioned proved invaluable for this process, as it documented what pieces had been in his collection and provided a basis for tracking them. Many artworks from Göring's Carinhall collection have been successfully returned to rightful owners or to countries and institutions from which they were looted. The post-war restitution process, while imperfect and incomplete, succeeded in recovering and returning thousands of pieces that Göring had stolen. However, the process was complex and lengthy, particularly for artworks stolen from Jewish families who were murdered in the Holocaust and whose heirs were difficult to locate or did not exist. Some pieces from Göring's collection ended up in museums or were sold through the art market before their looted origins were discovered, creating restitution challenges that continue to this day. Legal battles over pieces from Göring's collection have occurred in recent decades, as heirs of original owners have sought recovery of family treasures, with varying outcomes depending on where the artworks are located and what legal frameworks apply. The artworks and objects that were not evacuated from Carinhall and that were destroyed in the demolition or that disappeared in its aftermath represent permanent losses to cultural heritage. Some pieces were destroyed by the explosions and fires that demolished the buildings, burned or shattered beyond recovery. Others may have been looted by Soviet soldiers or by local residents in the immediate post-war chaos, entering into unknown hands and potentially being lost forever or existing in private hands without known provenance. The full extent of what was lost in Carinhall's destruction will never be known, as records are incomplete and some items in Göring's collection were never fully documented. These losses represent not just the destruction of individual artworks, but also the erasure of historical evidence about what Göring had stolen and from whom, making restitution impossible, even if heirs exist. The broader legacy of Carinhall in historical memory and in contemporary understanding of the Nazi period is complex and multifaceted. Carinhall represents multiple aspects of Nazi Germany, including the corruption and personal enrichment of Nazi leaders, the systematic looting of occupied Europe's cultural heritage, the use of stolen wealth to create monuments to power and taste, the cult of personality and grandeur that characterized Nazi leadership, and ultimately the ephemeral nature of power built on theft and violence as the grandiose estate was reduced to rubble and has largely vanished from the landscape. Historians have used Carinhall as a case study for understanding Göring's personality, his corruption, his role in art looting, and his lifestyle. The estate's brief existence from the mid-1930s to 1945 and its complete destruction and subsequent obscurity serve as metaphors for the Nazi regime itself, which seemed powerful and permanent, but collapsed completely, and has left behind only ruins and historical records. Carinhall has appeared in historical literature, in documentaries about Göring and about Nazi art looting, and in various cultural productions about the Nazi period. The estate's dramatic story of construction, filling with looted treasures, evacuation, and deliberate destruction, has narrative appeal and illustrates broader historical themes. However, Carinhall has not achieved the same level of name recognition as some other Nazi sites, perhaps because it no longer exists in any meaningful physical form, and because it was a private estate rather than a site of government function or of specific crimes against humanity. It remains primarily of interest to specialists in Nazi history, in art looting, and in Göring's biography rather than being widely known to the general public. The contrast between Carinhall's fate and that of other Nazi properties and estates is instructive. Hitler's Berghof, mountain retreat, was similarly destroyed by bombing and then demolition, and like Carinhall, little remains visible today. However, the Berghof site has received more attention and interpretation through the development of the Obersalzberg Documentation Center, which provides extensive historical context. Other Nazi properties have been repurposed for various uses, demolished completely, or preserved as historical sites depending on individual circumstances. Carinhall's fate of destruction, followed by benign neglect and gradual natural reclamation, represents one approach among many to dealing with Nazi architectural and cultural legacy, an approach that emphasizes neither preservation nor complete erasure, but rather allows time and nature to gradually remove physical traces, while maintaining historical memory through documentation and modest interpretation. The environmental recovery of the Carinhall site is notable. The Schorfheide forest where Carinhall was located is now a protected biosphere reserve, recognized for its ecological value and its diverse habitats. The area that was cleared and landscaped for Göring's estate has returned to forest, and the ecological impact of the estate's existence has been largely erased through natural processes of succession and regeneration. This environmental recovery demonstrates nature's resilience and its ability to reclaim human-disturbed landscapes, turning what was a monument to human power and excess back into forest ecosystem. The return of the Carinhall site to nature can be seen as a fitting end to the estate's story, with the grandiose construction and the accumulated treasures ultimately giving way to the forest that predated them and that has outlasted them. The Schorfheide area's history extends far beyond the Nazi period and Carinhall's brief existence. The forest has been used for centuries as hunting grounds, has been the site of various human activities, and has historical and cultural significance independent of its Nazi-era associations. The area's interpretation today emphasizes this broader history and the forest's ecological values, rather than focusing extensively on the Nazi period, though that history is acknowledged. This approach of placing the Nazi period in the context of longer historical continuities and of emphasizing other aspects of an area's significance beyond its Nazi associations represents one strategy for dealing with places that have difficult heritage, neither ignoring the past nor allowing it to completely define how places are understood and used in the present. For those interested in Göring and in Nazi art looting, Carinhall remains a significant historical site, despite its ruined condition, and despite limited interpretation on site. The estate represents the physical manifestation of Göring's power and corruption, and its destruction represents the collapse of that power and the defeat of Nazi Germany. Visiting the overgrown ruins, even in their current minimal state, can provide a connection to this history and can prompt reflection on themes of power, greed, theft, and downfall. However, the site's current condition also means that much must be supplied by visitors' imagination and historical knowledge, as the physical remains themselves communicate relatively little without extensive context and interpretation. The scattered bricks and foundations require the viewer to know about Carinhall's history to be meaningful, as they appear to be simply forest debris rather than remnants of one of Nazi Germany's most impressive and most corrupt private estates. The documentation of Carinhall through photographs, through Göring's art inventory albums, through architectural plans, through testimony from those who visited or worked there, and through historical research has created an extensive historical record that preserves knowledge about the estate even though the physical structure has vanished. This documentation allows historians to reconstruct what Carinhall was like, how it functioned, what treasures it contained, and what it represented in Nazi Germany's social and cultural world. The photographs taken by Göring's staff showing the rooms filled with artworks, the great hall set for entertaining, the grounds landscaped and maintained, and the various facilities and features provide a visual record that future generations can consult to understand what existed at this now forested site. This documentation is preserved in archives and has been published in various historical works, ensuring that Carinhall's memory survives even as its physical traces gradually disappear. The story of Carinhall also raises broader questions about the relationship between power, wealth, culture, and morality. Göring created an estate that by conventional aesthetic standards was impressive, filled with genuine masterpieces of art and furnished with taste and luxury. However, the estate and its contents were built on theft, on the exploitation of Göring's power to enrich himself, on the suffering of those from whom art was stolen, and on the broader crimes of Nazi Germany that Göring helped perpetrate and from which he profited. This raises uncomfortable questions about how we should view cultural achievements and beautiful objects when they are tainted by criminal acquisition. Can looted art be appreciated aesthetically even while condemning the theft? Should estates and collections built on corruption be preserved for their cultural value or destroyed as monuments to crime? These questions have no simple answers and continue to be debated in contexts beyond Carinhall, as museums and collectors continue to grapple with how to handle objects with problematic provenances, and as societies decide how to memorialize or reject difficult heritage.